Apple's new iPhone 14 has this cool feature called Dynamic Island. It's basically this really cool piece of MoGraph that lives on the new iPhone, and today we're gonna recreate it in After Effects. So this tech YouTuber, Mark Spurrell, really great YouTube channel, by the way, took some video of the Dynamic Island in action, and I wanna show it to you. I love this because it's just animation principles. It looks really fancy and there's a lot of little nuance to it, but in the end, if you understand animation principles, you can make this. So how do we go about recreating it? All right, well, the first thing we're gonna do is recreate what happens to the foreground app. So this layer is going to basically dip down into the screen and go upwards on the y-axis and also rotate on the x-axis. So for that to happen, I'm gonna need it to be a 3D layer. And I'm gonna put keyframes on the properties I know I'm gonna be using. So X rotation, and then Y position and Z position. Now you may have noticed that my position properties are already separated. So if yours aren't, you can actually just hold Control, click, and make sure that this is checked. But I actually prefer to work this way, so I'm gonna show you a cool preference setting. If you go up to After Effects, Preferences General, you can set After Effects to default position properties to separated dimensions. And if you prefer to work in the value graph like I do, then this makes a lot of sense. All right, so we have 3 properties we need to keyframe, and I wanna know how quick this move happens. So let's go back to our reference, and let's just kind of count the frames. So starting here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 9 frames for that foreground app to disappear into the island. So I'm gonna jump forward 10 frames with Shift Page down. And let's start by pushing the layer back in Z space. And I'm gonna do this until it feels about the same size as the reference, where it feels like it can compress a little bit. Maybe a mask can come in and kind of make it feel a little bit more circular, and then it can disappear behind this island. So that feels pretty good. And then I'll adjust Y position until the center of that layer is in the center of that island. And then I'll just go a few frames in, and let's adjust the X rotation and have this thing dip down like it's diving into the screen. Maybe a little bit more. There we go. All right, now we need to figure out timing and spacing. So the timing on the rotation, I think we want to finish that rotation about halfway, maybe a little bit past the halfway point in the movement. And if we ram preview this, aha, it's done. It's basically done, right? No, and this is where we need to start getting into the graph editor and getting our hands dirty. So let's start with the position keyframes. I'm gonna select all of these and go into the graph editor. And you can see by default, the keyframes are linear. That's why you're seeing these straight lines. But if I select the keyframes and hit F9, now they are easy eased. I don't want them easy eased. I actually want to be very deliberate about how these things move. And to start, why don't we just deal with Z position? When you swipe, I want the movement to start pretty quickly. I don't want like a huge ease out, but then I do want it to basically be accelerating all the way into the dynamic island. And so since we're looking at the value graph, and by the way, you can tell by clicking this button and just making sure that it's the value graph, steepness equals speed. And so if I flatten out the curve, that means it is slower at this point in time. And if I steepen it, that means it's faster. So I want it to be a little bit flat at the beginning, not super flat like this, but just a little bit. But at the end, I don't want it flat at all. I want it to be accelerating all the way in. I also want that to be happening on the Y position, right? So a little bit of an ease in the beginning, but then at the end, I want it accelerating all the way into the end. And for X rotation, I want it to actually happen pretty quickly. So I'm gonna easy ease both of these keyframes and maybe have a little bit of an ease and then have an ease at the end because I do want it to kind of feel like it stabilizes. But there's not many frames. It's happening over 6 frames. All right, and let's preview this. Cool, so it's already feeling better. But we need to tweak this, all right? And I think the Z position is the thing that needs the most tweaking. It's not dipping fast enough. So let's go to the middle of the animation here. At this point in the animation, I want this layer to be further down into the screen, which means that this curve actually needs to be higher up here. So what I could do is just play with this first keyframe, do something like this. I could also play with the last keyframe and pull it left and right and see where it's gonna move the layer to the right spot. And I also think I need to adjust where this thing ends up in Z space on the last frame. So I'm gonna go to this last keyframe, go over to Z position, and bring it even further back. And then I'll adjust the graph. Cool, so now kind of scrubbing through it, that feels better. But that did screw up the Y position, so now I need to fix that and tweak that graph again. And by the way, this is what it looks like to animate. Sometimes it's just trying, nope, and finally you land on the right value. Cool. All right, that is feeling better. And I do want a little bit more X rotation. I think it'll be nice if it's a little bit more noticeable. So I'm gonna dip it a little bit more, and I'd like it to dip a little bit faster. So I'm gonna go forward a few frames, and I'm gonna mess around with the easing on this first keyframe to get a little bit of a quicker dip, and then a little bit of a longer ease at the end too. All right, cool. So now we've got a good starting point. Now you may notice in the reference, there's motion blur on all of these things. So let's turn that on, because then it's gonna be a little bit easier to gauge how closely we're matching. So I'll grab the website layer and I will turn on motion blur. And that did help. Now, as this foreground app moves towards the island, it also dips to black, and it kind of turns a little bit more circular shape, like the shape of the app actually changes. And so now we can mimic that. So changing the color of it to black is gonna be very straightforward. Before I do that though, I'm gonna select all of the keyframes on this layer and move them forward 5 frames, just so that we have a little bit of time on the front end of this animation. There we go. Okay, so with this layer selected, I'm gonna go up to Effect, Color Correction, Tint, and I'm gonna leave Map Black to black, but I'm gonna map white also to black. Now, why am I using the tint effect and not the fill effect? Well, it's because the tint effect has this property, amount to tint. And so I can set this to 0 at the beginning of the animation and set a keyframe. And then I can jump forward to the end and set it to 100%. So now that layer will fade to black. And I actually want it to be pretty much fully black by here. And so now that layer fades to black really easily. Now, how are we gonna change the shape of it? Well, I think probably the easiest way would be to use a track matte. So on this frame, I need a track matte around this layer that basically matches the shape of the layer. But as we get towards the dynamic island, I need it to start being more circular. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go to the first frame. I'm gonna grab a rectangle shape tool, and I'm just gonna roughly try to match the shape of this. Then I'm gonna change the fill color to something that's really contrasty so it's easier to see. And I'm gonna hit T to bring up the opacity and bring it down pretty low. And then I'll zoom in. So now what I wanna do is adjust this shape layer and move it around and adjust the size of it so it matches the layer as closely as I can. And that'll be a lot easier if I don't have those lines on the border of the shape. So to turn them off, I can click this button. Now on this layer, which I am going to rename matte, I can double tap U. Now you may already know that U is called the Uber key, and it reveals any keyframes you have on your layers. But if you double tap U, it will reveal any properties that have been changed from the defaults. And that's really handy on rectangular paths because the size is almost always changed. And so now the size property is right there. And I can close and open this little group here to also access roundness because I do need this to have rounded corners. So first I'll mess with the size property and get that as close as I can, maybe nudge the layer over a little bit. I'll go down to the bottom, check that out. And once I'm happy with that, I can just adjust the roundness property to try to match. Cool, and I think that is pretty good. It's definitely gonna work for our purposes. So I can turn the mask and shape path visibility back on. I can turn the transparency of the matte back up to 100%. And I can move it above this layer like so. Now I'm gonna take my SOM site layer and I'm gonna tell it to use that new matte layer as an alpha matte. And because I matched the size and shape of it initially, it didn't do anything, it looks the same. So now I can actually just manipulate that matte like this, and that's how I'm gonna change the shape of that foreground app to a circle at the end. Now I want the matte to follow the movement of this layer, so I need to make it a 3D layer. I'll also turn on motion blur, and then I'm gonna parent it to the layer underneath it. So now that matte layer will actually follow that layer as it dips and swoops and goes into the dynamic island. Now I wanna change the shape of this matte over time. So what I'm gonna do is double tap U. Here's my rectangle path. I'm gonna change the size and maybe the roundness over time. So I want it to maintain this shape until probably about here, and then it will start to change. So I'll set size and roundness keyframes. I'll go forward, and I'm gonna put the keyframes here while I can still see it. So first, I'm gonna set the X and Y size properties to be the same. And that's because it will then make that rectangle into a square. And when I jack up the roundness setting, it will turn it into a circle. So I'm just gonna copy this X property and paste it into the Y property. And you can see now we have a square. And then I'm gonna increase roundness until it looks like a circle. And now I'm gonna step forward until the end and see how big that circle is relative to the dynamic island. And it's too big. I'm no expert, but it's too big. So now I'm gonna lock the X and Y size properties and shrink this thing like this. And then I can pull this keyframe back here and let's take a look at it. Okay, cool. So it is working, but there are some issues. And the main issue is that as this circle gets close to the island, it's going so fast, we don't actually see it make contact. And so it's not gonna feel very good. So a couple things we could try. One is we could spread these keyframes out a little bit further so that it has a little bit more time as being larger in the frame. But that's not gonna solve the problem of not actually seeing the impact with the island. So to fix that, I'm gonna go back to this layer and I'm gonna look at the value graph for Y position. So this is something I do all the time when I'm animating. There's 1 or 2 frames that I wanna be really, really precious about and specific. And so I'll use the graph editor while I'm actually just looking at that frame to manipulate things and get the timing and spacing exactly the way I want. So this is the final frame where that circle has disappeared, but the frame right before it, I would like this blurry shape to actually be touching the island. So what I can do is select that last keyframe, and I want you to watch up here as I manipulate the Bezier handle. That sounds kind of dirty, by the way, manipulate the Bezier handle. I shouldn't say that anymore. As I bend this yellow thing, watch what happens. I can really precisely control where that second to last frame ends up. And then I could go back 1 frame, and now I can just kind of shuffle through it with the page up and page down. And that little bitty tweak is gonna make you feel that impact a lot more. See the difference there? Little tiny moves on the graph editor, it makes a huge difference. And now we can start animating the dynamic island itself. But to do that, I'm gonna need it to be a shape layer. So first, let's make a shape layer that matches the shape of this. That should be pretty easy. Let's grab a rectangle tool, and I'm just gonna kind of do my best to get it the same size. And I'm gonna do the same thing I did before, just turn down the opacity a little bit. I'm gonna turn off the edges so I can see really precisely. And I got pretty close, but it looks like it needs to be a little bit taller and a little bit narrower. And then I can adjust the roundness, and we're good to go. Let me turn the opacity back up, set the fill to black, and rename this DI for Dynamic Island. And then I can turn off the reference layer from Photoshop. So let's take a look at the reference and see what happens on the phone when that dynamic island is impacted. So you'll notice it kind of swallows the foreground app and grows like it was this hungry black hole or something. And then it shrinks back down, but it kind of overshoots and oscillates a little bit. And then it moves to the side and it spits out a little circle. So we've got a few things we need to build, and we're gonna do this in stages. So we'll start with the first part of the move, which is when the impact happens right about there. Let's zoom in so we can see this better. And I'm gonna animate the size and position of the dynamic island. So double tap U, here's my rectangle path size property. I'll put a keyframe here, and I'm also gonna put a keyframe on the Y position of this layer. Now, the layer is moving pretty quick when it impacts it, so I want the impact to feel like there's some power behind it. So I'm only gonna go forward a few frames here, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6, and then I'm gonna adjust the size. If I look at the reference, you can see that the dynamic island scales up basically just big enough to touch the very top of the phone. And then it settles back down. So let's adjust the size property up, maybe something like that, and scale it out. So this is when it's sort of eating, right? Because when it feeds, it grows. And then I'm also gonna adjust the Y position so that it just kisses the top of the screen like that. And let's exaggerate that a little bit more. Let's make that bigger. When we can scrub that and see that it's gonna feel pretty good, but we're gonna need to adjust the curves. So let's go to the graph editor and look at the size property. Now the size property has actually 2 properties in it, X and Y size. And it's gonna be kind of tricky to adjust these using the value graph. And so I'm gonna pull out my old friend, Flow. Flow is one of my favorite add-ons to After Effects. I use it on basically every project I touch, and it's really useful in situations like this, because what it will let me do is manipulate multiple properties at the same time, applying the same easing to them. So what kind of easing do I want on this move? Well, it's an impact, and impacts happen instantly. So the beginning of this movement, I don't want any easing on it. But then it is gonna kind of slow itself down as it approaches the edge. So I think this is actually probably a decent looking curve for it. And the way I have Flow set up is as soon as I adjust the animation curve up here, it adjusts down here in the graph. So let's see how this feels. That feels pretty good. And so what happens next is that island's gonna kind of settle down, it's gonna compress, and then it's gonna stretch out and spit out a smaller island, like our little round island, and then it'll settle back to its shape. So when you've got a complicated sequence of events like that, I first like to just rough things out, okay? And I'm not concerned at this point with the timing and the spacing so much. All right, so it needs to shrink back down vertically. So I'm just gonna copy the original size keyframe here. But it should be a little bit wider still. So I'm gonna look at how wide it is here, and I'm gonna try to kind of maintain that as it shrinks down. I also want it to return to the original Y position, so I'm gonna copy and paste this keyframe. After that, I want it to compress in a little bit of an anticipation to kind of telegraph that something's about to happen. So we'll go forward a few more frames, and then I'm gonna adjust the size in a little bit, a few more frames, and out, but it's gonna kind of go a little bit too far, and then it's gonna go back in to where it started, the original size. Now let's go into the graph editor. I'm gonna hit Shift F3, that's the hotkey, and I'm gonna select all of these keyframes. And this is what the graph looks like right now. It is kind of a mess. So step one, select all the keyframes, hit F9, and that kind of sets up like a nice flat easy ease on every single keyframe. And this is why I love using the graph editor. I can look at this and instantly know I don't have the correct values in there for the animation that I want. If I play this, it doesn't look right. This is not my intent. And I bet you've animated stuff before where you think you know what you're doing and then you play it back and you're like, wait, that doesn't work right. And to be honest, I'm not sure why. Let me show you how the graph editor is gonna tell you why. Remember the intent here. The island is swelling up because it just ate the foreground app, and it's eventually gonna end up back at its original size. But in between those two moments, it's gonna oscillate gently like this. And so what that means is this keyframe needs to be below this one. This keyframe needs to be above, and then this one needs to be below. Now we have a sine wave that is decaying. Now you may not be used to thinking of animation curves in terms of sine wave and decay, but follow along, I promise you, it's gonna make sense. So just for making that tweak, let's RAM preview this and see what it looks like. It's already starting to work much, much better, and there's no way I could have done it that quickly without the graph editor. So what's happening here is we have a value for the size, and this red line is the X value, which is the primary thing that we're concerned with right now. And so it gets hit by the foreground layer, it grows, and it touches the top of the screen. I'd like it to hang there for a second, like the momentum is basically pinning it to the top of the phone. So the way I can do that is by grabbing this keyframe and pulling this handle out so that as we exit this keyframe, it takes a little bit longer for the value to change. So it's gonna feel like it's stuck there a little bit longer. And then it goes a little bit too far because remember, it's gonna end at this value here, but it dipped a little bit too low. Like it had too much momentum carrying it, and that's kind of a physically plausible reason for it to go too far. A lot of what we do as animators is trying to mimic physics in things that don't have it. So that momentum will force it to go too low and kind of stick there for a second. So I'm gonna pull out this Bezier handle to make it kind of hang there. I'm also gonna do one other trick I like to do sometimes. I'm gonna select this one keyframe, and I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna turn on Auto Bezier. Now, when I do that, it's gonna screw up my easing, so I'll fix that really quickly. But what it does is it locks the angle of these Bezier handles. So now if I click one and drag it, it will actually pull the other one and keep them parallel. And what's cool about this is that now you see this curve never actually gets flat. There's always movement happening across this property. And so the effect that that tends to have is to make things feel a little bit springy. I'll RAM preview and you can see what I mean. It's feeling a little bit extreme, so I'm just gonna make these feel a little bit less wild by compressing the amount of deviation from this final value like this. I'm usually not subtle, but sometimes it's the right thing to do. So the size is feeling pretty good. Let's take a look at Y position. All right, so remember, it gets hit and it should basically pretty much instantly start moving up and then get pinned to the top of the frame. Now, it's actually not moving very much on Y. You can see it's only moving, gosh, not even a pixel. So this isn't gonna make a huge difference, but we might as well be thorough. And what's interesting is on playback, what I'm noticing is that it's not actually hitting the top of the frame for long enough for it to register. If I go to this frame and I zoom in, you can see it is touching the top of the frame, but when I play it back, I need a little bit more. So what I'm gonna do is adjust the Y position and just cheat it a little bit higher. So now I really get like 2 or 3 frames where it's touching the top of the phone. And when I play it back, now it feels a little bit stickier up there. Let's look at the reference and see how we're stacking up. Now, it's always good to check the reference, and when I look at it, I notice ours is way more bouncy than that. So in trying to be subtle, I failed, but that's okay. It's really easy to change this stuff and adjust it. So it grows, it shrinks down, and the thing that isn't subtle is this oscillation. And so I'm gonna be a little bit more precise here. We're ending up with a size of 93.2. Let's just round that up to 95, just to make it a little bit easier to do math. Now on this first overshoot, we're deviating from that by about 10 pixels. I'll make it exactly 10. And so if I wanna minimize this, why don't I just cut that in half? So if we're gonna end at 95 and we're starting at 85, why don't I split the difference and say, no, let's start at 90. Now the next value is about 7 above that 95 number. So let's cut that in half and say 3.5, so 98.5. And then this last keyframe right before we settle into the end, I want that to be really, really close to 95. So I'm just gonna make it 92. Now this should look a lot subtler. There we go. And the other thing we can do is stretch out the timing of this. And I can do that by selecting every keyframe, holding Option, then grabbing the last keyframe and just pulling it out a little bit. That is much closer. And now the only thing that's really out of place is this big snap right there. So let's fix that. Let's go into the graph editor and figure out what's going on. And that is happening because of how far out I pulled this Bezier handle and how steep this curve is right here. Much better. Now, if you're not used to using the graph editor like this and really understanding the nuances of it and learning to listen to it and let it talk to you, check out Animation Bootcamp. It's one of our most popular courses at School of Motion, and it's basically an animation principles course inside of After Effects. A lot of After Effects users get really good at using the app, but they never actually learn the principles of animation, and especially how those principles are applied inside of After Effects. And so I created Animation Bootcamp for animators like myself who never went to art school and never got to learn those principles the right way. I promise you the class will change every single project you touch for the rest of your career. Thousands of artists have already gone through it and the reviews are incredible, so check it out, link in the description. So the next thing that happens is we get this little baby island that spits out from the mama island. So let's create that. I'm gonna duplicate the dynamic island layer and let's name this one DI-circle, and then I'll reveal all the keyframes and delete them. And to make this a circle, all I need to do is make sure that the X and Y size properties are equal. So I'll just set X to 37.1 so it matches Y, and then I can scoot this over and you see now we have this perfect little circle. And it's gonna end up about this far away from mama, which means that both of them are gonna have to move to the left. So how do we do that? Well, let's start by temporarily parenting the circle to the original dynamic island. And then on the dynamic island layer, let's put a keyframe on X position. Now, when should that move start? I think it should probably start right around here somewhere once it starts to come back down, right? So I'm just gonna put the keyframe here and we'll play with timing. I'll go forward to the end when it's settled, and then let's move this back and try to get these things roughly centered on the phone. And that looks about right. Now I can easy ease these. And for this move, I think we're basically just gonna have a pretty standard hard ease. And so I can use flow for this. I can just use one of the presets like cubic, and now I get this nice symmetrical ease. So the move is a little bit too, obvious right now. So I'm gonna take the first keyframe and move it backwards a little bit, and then I'm gonna stretch out that animation so it takes longer. And I'm also gonna pull that last ease a little bit harder and go a little softer on the first one. Now it feels a little more gentle, and I think once the circle actually pops out of it, that'll kind of motivate the original island moving backwards. So let's go to the end here and let's unparent the circle layer and then put an X position keyframe on it. And let's figure out when is it actually gonna spit out of this layer? Well, it's gonna be probably right about here once the dynamic island kind of bulges out like that. So on this frame, the circle should be completely contained within the island like that. I'm gonna hit Option left bracket to trim this layer so it doesn't start until this frame. And then let's go forward, 6, 7 frames. And let's have that be the point at which this circle spits out. And then we'll grab those keyframes, easy ease, go into the graph editor. And again, think about what's happening here. This circle is being spit out. So it should be pretty fast initially, and then it'll have a hard ease at the end. And so what does that look like in the graph editor? Well, it's gonna be coming out pretty fast, not super fast. This would be really fast, but I'm just gonna keep it relatively linear, but then put a big, nice hard ease on the end. So something like that. There we go. And that looks pretty good, but I want even more of an ease. So I'm just gonna extend that animation a little bit. I'm gonna pull this out a few more frames, and that's gonna give me more time. And that's gonna allow me to extend that ease even a little bit further. All right, now let's watch this a few times because the devil's in the details. And this is the point where I'm really trying to dial things in. Now let's watch this a couple of times. All right, one of my old business partners had this expression whenever I would get obsessed with some stupid detail that no one cares about but me. He would say, I have a hair across my ass. Well, right now I have a hair across my ass. The way that this circle pops out doesn't feel right to me. It feels like the timing is off, like it's happening too soon or too fast or something. So I'm gonna knock this forward 1 frame so it pops out slightly later. That feels better, but also I think it's coming out too fast. So maybe I do need to bend this curve a little bit forward and put a little bit of an ease on it. there's still a little hitch in the movement. And I think what's happening is on the first frame when this circle layer exists, you can't see it at all, but it's already moving. And so it feels a little weird when it just pops out in the next frame. So I'm actually gonna move it over a little bit. So you can actually already start to see it. And now I'm happy with it. I know it barely made any difference what I just did, but little details like that kind of stick out to me. And to be honest, I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight if I hadn't fixed it. But also, I thought maybe it'd be cool to show you the level of nuance that you can really get into when you start understanding animation principles and the way they work in After Effects and you get comfortable in the graph editor. You can really get very precise. All right, so the motion of this stuff is starting to look pretty good, but there's some details we're missing. If we go back to the reference, you'll see that when the foreground app starts to move, everything in the background is blurry, and then the icons kind of scale up and settle, which looks really nice. So that should be pretty easy to implement. Let's start with blurring the background. So the background is split up into a few layers. I've got the kind of wallpapery texture, and then I've got the icons broken out into a few different pieces. So what I'm gonna do is just put a Gaussian blur effect on the background layer, and let's blur that until we think it looks appropriate, and probably something like that. Now we have this problem where blurring it also blurred the edges, which we don't want. So what we can do is just take this layer and duplicate it, and let's rename that second layer so it has matte at the end of it. Get rid of the Gaussian blur, and then tell this original layer to use that new layer as an alpha matte. So now it's cropping it at the boundary of the original edge, and so the edges are sharp again. So I'm gonna scrub through, and I think probably by this point, the background should be sharp again. So I'm gonna put a keyframe here, and let's go to the first frame and set a keyframe, and then we'll jump forward to that last keyframe again and set the blurriness to 0. Pretty straightforward. Now I'm gonna mess with the timing of this blurriness, and I might even get into the graph editor a little bit, but we have a problem. The problem is that the icons, both up here and down here in the dock, those are gonna get blurred as well. And if I have 3 copies of the blur effect and 3 sets of keyframes, it's gonna be kind of a pain to tweak things. So here's a really neat trick. If I select this effect and I go up to Edit, Copy with Property Links, and then I paste that effect onto these 2 layers. Here's what it did. It copied the Gaussian blur effect onto both of those layers, but it did so with expressions on every property. And what's cool about doing it this way is you don't actually have to understand what the expressions are doing. After Effects just writes them for you. But if you want to know, it's basically saying, get the blurriness value from the home screen layer and use that. So that's the original layer. And what that means is that the blurs of all 3 layers are now synced. And so now if I scrub through this, you can see this is working actually pretty well. But I can't help myself. So I'm going to easy ease those, go into the graph editor. And if I pull this out, that's going to have the effect of making the blur take longer to go away in the beginning. So you'll see it for a little bit longer, which is kind of nice. And then I can ease into the crisp version a little bit later and take a little longer, and that feels pretty nice. Now, as the blur is kind of wearing off, these icons should be scaling up. So with both layers selected, I can hit Option S. Let's zoom in a little bit, and we'll do this 1 layer at a time. So we'll start with the icons, which are these. So I'm just gonna go back a few frames to where I can still see them, and I'm gonna scale them down. And I'm gonna scale them down to, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 80%. Feels good? And so now they'll scale up. But notice where the anchor point is on this layer. So when you scale layers, I want you to think not just about the fact that the layer is growing, but that the edges of the layer are moving in a direction, right? And so if the anchor point is at the bottom of a layer, it's gonna tend to have this visual effect of making the edges look like they're going up. And if the anchor point is in the middle of a layer, it's gonna look like things are moving outwards in all directions. This anchor point is at the bottom of the icons. And so that means that it's gonna make them feel like they're all moving up and out. If I go to the last frame, and it's really important that you go to the ending frame when you do this, I can hit the Y key to bring up my anchor point tool, and I can hold Shift so I can move it up and down, and I can drag it a little bit higher. And now you'll see that those bottom icons are also moving down. So now you're not just getting the movement of things going up and out, but also going up and out and down and out. And that may feel a little bit better in certain situations. Now for these icons, it didn't make a giant difference, but for the dock icons, it will make a big difference. So if I leave the anchor point where it is by default, which is up in the middle of the phone, and I scale these down to about 80%, you'll see that they now have a long way to go. They're gonna move quite the distance, and that's gonna be really, really extreme feeling. So what I think makes sense is to take that anchor point and move it much closer to the dock icons. Now they don't have to move as far, and that move will not feel as extreme. So timing wise, I want that move to start, pretty much at the beginning. And what I think I want, we'll find out, is a pretty hard ease on the end. So I'm gonna grab those last keyframes, pull it like this. But I also think we want an ease on the beginning because I want you to be able to see the icons small for enough frames to catch that they're growing. So let's play this and see how it feels. It's working okay, but I'm not really feeling that scale happening on the icons. So how can we solve that? Well, if I scrub through, you'll see you can't even see the icons, even theoretically, until this frame. So there's really no point in the move happening before then. So why don't I just go ahead and move that first keyframe up a little bit and see if that helped. So that helped a lot. And why don't I also take the ending keyframes and just move them up, 2 frames. And I just had an idea. So there's this principle I talk about in Animation Bootcamp called eye trace. And it's the idea that as an animator, you can control the viewer's eye. And in this case, we're controlling the viewer's eye from the bottom of the phone up to the top. So if I animate things at the bottom first, and then things animate a little bit higher and higher and higher, your eye will naturally be drawn upwards. So wouldn't it be cool if these dock icons finished their animation a little bit before these, because this motion will catch your eye after this one is done. So I'll take this final dock keyframe, move it back 2 frames. And boy, is that subtle, but I like it. So next up, we need to animate the time and these little battery and Wi-Fi icons up in the corners. They sort of pop out once the dynamic island expands like that. So I have those in this one layer called time. So I'm gonna duplicate that so I can separate them out. So we'll have time and time icons. And I'm just gonna grab my rectangular mask and very quickly mask these out. So we'll scrub through the animation. And I think right here where the dynamic island starts to expand again, that's where it should push out these 2 layers. So let me grab these 2 layers. I'll make them a different color too, so it's a little bit easier to find them. And I'll open up their position properties and put X position keyframes on there. And I think that move should take, maybe half a second. So this is 24 frames per second comp. I'll go forward 12 frames and put another keyframe. Let's go back to the first keyframe and I'll trim the layers with Option left bracket. And while I'm here, why don't I also set the opacity keyframes because they should be at 0 in the beginning, but then at the end, they should be at 100%. And I'm just gonna select each layer, hold Shift and nudge them 3 ticks inwards towards the dynamic island. Then I'll grab those position keyframes, easy ease them. And why don't I use flow to set up the animation for this? I want a little bit of an ease on the beginning, but I want them to move pretty fast initially, but then have a really hard ease into that last keyframe. All right, that's too fast. So I'm just gonna stretch out the timing of this animation a little bit. And I also feel like they might be appearing a little bit too soon. So I'm gonna Option page down and have them come out a couple of frames later. And that feels much better. It feels like they're reacting to the dynamic island expanding. And there's only really one detail left to deal with here. And that detail is this: watch when the circle comes out. Now it's a little bit tough to see on this compressed version, but on this frame especially, you can see that that circle doesn't come out nice and clean. It's not like there's just 2 vectors intersecting. It almost looks like there's a liquid nature to these shapes and they kind of are sticking to each other and the edges are kind of blurring and pulling against each other. So how do we do that? There's a really cool trick. I learned this a long time ago. I don't remember who taught it to me, but it's a tale as old as time. So I'm gonna select my dynamic islands. I'm gonna pre-compose them. I'll call this DI pre-comp. We'll hop in there. And what we're trying to do is basically mush these shapes together so the edges aren't so discrete. So here's the trick. I'm gonna make a new solid. I'm gonna name this liquid. I'm gonna turn it into an adjustment layer and I'm gonna put a Gaussian blur effect on it. Now watch right here and look what happens to the edges of these shapes as I crank up the blur. So you can see how they're starting to touch and kind of mush together a little bit. Now we have some issues. One is we're getting these hard edges. That's happening because repeat edge pixels is turned on. So I'll turn that off. But the main issue is they're blurry and they're not supposed to be blurry. So we like the kind of organic quality that this gives the overall shape, but we don't like that it is actually blurry. So I'm gonna show you how to fix this and then I wanna explain what's happening. I'm gonna throw a levels effect on here, but instead of leaving it in RGB mode like you typically do, I'm gonna switch it to alpha. Now you can see that there's black and white information in the alpha channel. An alpha channel is just a black and white image and white pixels tell that layer to be opaque and black pixels tell that layer to be transparent. Gray pixels tell the layer to be semi-transparent. So why don't we actually look at the alpha channel of what's going on here? And we can do that by clicking on this button here and selecting alpha. And now you can see exactly what's happening when you blur something. Outside of that shape, it's black, inside it's white, but the edge has this gradient to it and we don't want that. So if we're manipulating the levels of the alpha channel, I could say, well, why don't we just make some of these fuzzy pixels here? Why don't we make them white? And we do that with the white input, and we lower it, and now we have more white pixels. But why don't we get rid of some of these pixels on the edge too? Why don't we just make them black? Well, we do that by manipulating the black input. And now you can see what's happening. We're compressing the dynamic range of the alpha channel on the edge of these shapes, and it has the effect of making the edges crisp again. We can go back to the color channels to see what it looks like, and you can see now it is starting to look a little bit more fluid. The edges still aren't great, so let's just compress this a little bit more. And that looks pretty good. Now, I gotta warn you, if you go too far, you'll get edges that look like this and it'll look kind of crappy, so don't do that. And so now if I kind of page up and page down through this, you can see you get this really cool looking fluid effect. Now, one danger of doing this is that if you're not careful, you can actually expand the bounds of the shape or contract them, and now you've changed the size of your original art. So we do need to check that, and it's really easy. Just turn the adjustment layer off and on. So when it's off, you can see the shape is that big, and I turn it on and the shape gets smaller. So that means I'm gonna need more white pixels, less black pixels on that alpha channel. So I'm gonna take the black input and move it backwards, and you can see the shape is growing. And then I'll move the white input to crisp the edges back up. And now I'll check it again. And now we're pretty close, good enough. One last thing I do wanna do is have a little logo pop up here because I think that's a nice little detail. And what logo should we use? How about this one? That's perfect, and the size is good too. All right, let's scale this down really small. Make the logo smaller, they said. And let's parent that to the circle. And then we'll just animate the opacity. So we'll have it be 100% at the end of the movement, which is right about there. And right here, it can be 0. Beautiful. Well, here is our finished animation, and holy cow, a lot went into it. There was a lot of details, but I don't know, I think it looks pretty good. After doing this, I have an even greater appreciation for how hard this must have been to actually implement in the phone. You could see just how many little nuances and details there are to even something simple like this. And on the real phone, it's actually even crazier. But in any case, I really hope you picked up a trick or two and maybe have a little bit of a deeper appreciation and understanding for the graph editor and how you can use animation principles inside of After Effects. If you're a motion designer, you really do need to pay attention to the motion part of that term as much as the design part. And if you've never really learned to do this before, seriously, check out Animation Bootcamp. It's a great course to teach you exactly how to do what you saw me do today. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. And yeah, let me know what you thought in the comments, and I will see you on the next video.